welcome. I'm Christina Kwon, and this is a video presentation of my master thesis as a graduating harpsichord performance major at the Royal Conservatoire in The Hague, in the Netherlands. Now, this video is going to be about 16th century keyboard tablature notation. As you've seen in the title introduction, it's a unique type of notation that was found in the early 14th century. It was prominently in use from the 15th throughout the 17th centuries, and it was even partly in use in the 18th century. Now, the reason I chose this topic was because of my first encounter with it some 4 or 5 years ago. It was during my previous studies before coming to The Hague. My harpsichord colleagues back then and I had a group session with our teacher in which we looked at this 4-part madrigal now you see on the screen. As you can see, it's an intabulation of a popular tune of the day for the keyboard. And it comes from the Ammerbach Tablature book, which was printed in 1571 in Leipzig, Germany. The first time it was quite challenging for us because the notation looked quite unfamiliar. We just had to do a little bit of deciphering and get used to the script. But after 10 or so minutes of that examining, we were able to play one line on the harpsichord, which was the soprano line of this 4-part madrigal. And then eventually we could add the alto and the tenor and the bass voices, and 4 of us could play all 4 voices together at the harpsichord from this original notation. So it was a very fun experience, and it was quite memorable, even though it was a little bit challenging at first. So 2 years ago, when I was choosing a master research topic, I fell back on this experience because since then I've shared my experience in this notation with some early music colleagues, and I received quite interesting reactions. Some of them were quite negative. Some people told me why I would waste my time trying to play music from this, and for some this music was so old and not that relevant that trying to get used to this notation was going too far for them. And I see their points, I agree with their concerns, but you know, as a historical keyboard player, it really made me think a little bit because I was really convinced that historically informed performance practice is recreating something of the past in the most informed, authentic way possible. That's why we read treatises and we look at facsimiles of early prints and manuscripts and notes from composers and people of this era in which this music originated. We look at surviving antique instruments to get clues about technique and some of the possibilities and limitations of music on the instruments back then, and we make copies of these instruments so that we can perform. So I was really convinced this is what we do in the HIP circle. So when I encountered these reactions, it really made me think and to find out more about this unique type of keyboard notation that was quite neglected. I felt like it was quite neglected in the current historical keyboard performance dialogue. So I also wanted to find out why. So this video is gonna be about me sharing with you what tablature is, its definition, exclusively dealing with keyboard tablature, mainly from the 16th century, and what caused this type of notation to come about. Why tablature? What were the reasons or the context or the circumstances for this notation to come into use? And lastly, why are we perhaps so reluctant to look at a type of music notation as means of actually making music? Why don't we play it, or why don't we learn something from it? So I will be addressing some of the general remarks and reactions I received in the beginning stages of my research. You know, my response and analysis to it, including a very extensive experiment survey I conducted with 32 participants. Now, this will all culminate in answering my research question: is 16th century keyboard tablature notation still relevant in today's historically informed performance practice training as performance notation? So what is tablature? The definition and the usage of the word tablature is inconsistent even within the 16th century. For example, even some 16th century Italian keyboard sources will say something like in tablatura or in tablate. But actually, these are not in tablature notation. They're in two-staff score system, which is closer to the modern piano score we have. So, what is tablature in the most strict terms as a notational system? In the current and the last century, much has been written and discussed by musicologists about tablature as a categorized type of notation. And I've combined the information from my secondary sources and arrived at sort of this personally tailored, comprehensive definition. Tablature is a type of instrumental notation with letters or figures, sometimes combined with staff or other means of notation, in which musical tones are indicated by means of string, hole, fret, key to be touched. So it is a touch notation. And it's unique that it is exclusively instrumental. This definition holds true for all tablatures, for bowed and plucked strings, for flutes and recorders, and for keyboard and other instruments. However, in the case of keyboard tablature, just because of the very comprehensive layout of all the tones on the keyboard, it does not really necessarily require a very keyboard idiomatic technique. It's possible to play notes from keyboard tablature on other instruments, meaning a lute tablature could only be realized on a lute. A recorder tablature only makes sense on a recorder. But for example, a recorder might be able to play one line, one of the polyphonic lines from a keyboard tablature, because with how it is notated is sort of objectively in musical pitch or musical tones. This is why 16th century Spanish keyboard tablature was always printed in the same format along with the harp and the vihuela, which was the Spanish Baroque guitar. So what you see on the screen now is the title page of a treatise and music publication by Venegas de Henestrosa. It's called Libro de Cifra Nueva para Tecla, Arpa y Vihuela. It literally means a new cipher book for keyboard, harp, and vihuela. Now, this was published in Alcala in 1557. What you see on the screen now is a page from its very exhaustive preface on notation, music, technique, all performance practice things in general. You can see the layout of the notes on each instrument very clearly. Well, we can take a moment now to define Spanish tablature. So 16th century Spanish keyboard tablature is a notation of polyphonic music for the keyboard, but often published in the same format for the harp and vihuela using Arabic numerals 1 through 7. Now, if we go back to the previous illustration, you can see number 1 starts on F, and B flat or B is indicated by a bemol or a flat in the tablature. Other upper keys are indicated accordingly with sharps or flats. You can see some short pieces from Libro de Cifra Nueva that are in 2 or 3 voices. The next title page you see is from Obras de Música para Tecla, Arpa y Vihuela. Again, the title literally means works of music for keyboard, harp, and vihuela. This is mostly the music of the great Antonio de Cabezon, posthumously published by his son Hernando. This was published in Madrid in 1578. Now what you see here is a page from its very short preface explaining how polyphony is notated. So you can see that it has 4 lines indicating 4 different contrapuntal voices. Now this comes from the vihuela tablature tradition, in which a line represented each course on the vihuela. But now in this sort of hybrid keyboard, harp, vihuela tablature, it became each line indicating 1 voice. So now what you see is a piece from Obras de Música in 2 voices. And now you see 3 voices, and then 4 voices. So this publication progresses in this increasing number of voices, as well as in increasing difficulty, which makes it very pedagogical. So you might be wondering, why is tablature important at all? Why should you care? For me, it was very interesting because the very first known keyboard notation was in a form of tablature. Now, the earliest keyboard notation is found in the Robertsbridge Codex from the early 14th century. So a few leaves of this codex includes instrumental music, of which are a few pieces for the keyboard. So what you see on the screen now is an estampie from the codex. As you can see, the right hand is in an Italian mensural notation on a staff coming from the Renaissance and earlier traditions of vocal notation. And the left hand is indicated with alphabetical letters, which is in the style of early German tablature. And then there are even some words in English written to indicate repeat and so on. So it is a rather an interesting mix of different national elements found in this very ancient English source. Now, scholars consider this codex to be a unique specimen and the only extant manuscript of its kind. This really marks the beginning of keyboard notation. And then after this is no subsequent keyboard notation to be found until the 15th century. So there's sort of this century blank. As you can see on this list, these 15th century sources are all in tablature form, with the last one on the list, Das Buchsheimer Orgelbuch, being perhaps the most representative of keyboard notation from the 15th century. We don't know for certain why we have this blank of a century. What happened? Was nothing written, or is nothing surviving? None of my sources said this, but I personally think, also due to some of the recent events, that this may have been affected by the Great Bubonic Plague, also known as the Black Death or pestilence, which was a pandemic in Europe that peaked from 1347 to 1351. It is estimated to have killed up to 2/3 of Europe's population. Maybe, it caused this blank of a century. As we might understand, when there's a pandemic, music writing is not a priority. So after this blank century emerges this list of keyboard works. What you see now is a page from Das Buchsheimer Orgelbuch. As you can see, the right hand is notated on a single 7-line staff, and the left hand notated in alphabetical scripts with rhythm indications in dots and lines. Now, we can take a moment now to define early German keyboard tablatures. It was, as I said, one of the most representative forms of keyboard notation from the 15th century. Early German tablature is a system of notation that uses notes on a staff, usually for the highest voice, combined with alphabetical letters for the lower voices, for keyboard music usually in 2 or 3 parts. Now, what you see on the screen now is actually the piece that I showed you in the introduction. It's a sample of the new German tablature. Now, if the early German tablature had staff plus letters, you would think that you would drop the letters and go full staff because that's more modern, that's closer to the modern notation. But actually, surprisingly enough, the new German tablature drops the staff, not the letters, and goes full letters. So, and then in the new German style, we have 4 voices now, 4, 5, up to 6 more voices. Now, this starts sort of in the middle of the 16th century. So the early German tablature was the predominant form of keyboard notation from the beginning of 15th century and up till the mid 16th century. And with this new German style emerging in the middle of the 16th century became the prominent notation within the German scene, which includes not only Germany or the German-speaking countries, but also Northern European and Slavic. So yes, now you see this piece that we looked at already from Abenbach Tablaturbuch. And the next slide you see is from the Bernhard Schmidt Tablaturbuch, which was printed in Strasbourg in 1607. And as you can see, you see all 4 voices notated in letters. So let's take a moment to define the new German tablature. It's a system of notation for polyphonic keyboard music using alphabetical scripts. At this point, we can start addressing why was this notation in use, or why was it invented. Sort of the first and foremost reason is it's a lot easier to print tablature than it is to print other forms of notation. So what were some of the other forms of notation in other countries, in other scenes in the 16th century. All keyboard notation from early 14th to the turn of the 17th century can be divided into three different types. So first, keyboard score, meaning you would have two staves, very close to pretty much the modern piano score. You would have two staves. Some of them, sometimes the staff was 5 lines, or it could be 6 lines or 7 lines, as in the frescobaldi toccatas, engraved toccatas, or the English virginal music. So first is a keyboard score system. The second one that was prominent in Italy was the keyboard partitura, which means you would get a staff for each contrapuntal voice. So if you have a 4-part texture, you will have 4 staves. Now, this is actually harder to read and to perform from than tablature, but that's how they notate it. So you will have 4 staves for a 4-texture keyboard piece. Now, the third was tablature. Now, tablature was preferred by printers and publishers because you didn't have to deal with the staff lines. Now, printing technology was quite limited in the 16th century. Tablature was also done with figure, so numbers or letter scripts, which means even a non-music compositor could put together a page with only a select number of blocks. Now, if you take a look at keyboard score or keyboard partitura system, most of them were manuscripts, so you had to write it out. But even to print them, it was a lot of trouble because first of all, you have to print all the lines of the staffs, and you have to because you have to indicate harmony on the keyboard. It was very difficult to line up all the notes on the staff for printing. It caused a lot of trouble and also like caused a lot of mistakes. Whereas if you look at tablature, it saves space on the page, it saves ink. It's easy, you just need a set number of blocks. In fact, it was the only sort of preferred way of publication in Spain. The 16th and even into the 17th century, we don't really see anything other than the Spanish keyboard tablature. It was the predominant form of printing method. And also in Germany, they strictly stuck to the German tablature. In Italy and England and other parts of Europe, they had these other 2 systems, but clearly, even taking a look at the music, that it was very printer friendly. Another thing that we have to consider is that, what was happening in the 15th century into the 16th century. I mentioned printing, and the movable type printing press by Johannes Gutenberg was published around 1450, so mid 15th century. And printing became very cost efficient and very accessible. So now you are able to mass produce affordable print media, but what does that mean? That means you also have an audience for affordable print media. And this really marks the rise of amateurs and beginners and students being able to access music that is printed and distributed. So what was music? All music up to the turn of the 17th century was largely vocal music, which means, yes, vocal music with instruments accompanying or doubling, or purely instrumental music in the style of vocal music. This is why the first bulk of the keyboard repertoire is intabulations of madrigals. Those were keyboard realizations of vocal pieces. But if you think about it, how was this music executed? How was vocal music notated? They existed in parts. So either on the keyboard, you could imagine sometime in the 15th century, you have to do it either by heart, meaning you're trained in counterpoint and stylistic language that you can just realize an intabulation of a well-known tune of the day on the keyboard. Of course, this will take a lot of skill and talent and training. There are accounts of improvisation. Another thing that was possible is to play from parts. So you would put 4 different parts on a keyboard desk and try to realize a keyboard intabulation of the madrigal. Now, this also required a lot of skill and experience. It was very difficult to do it. So it was only for a select group of people. But tablature came around, and it was actually a notation that was invented to make music more accessible and playable, meaning it was meant for amateurs and beginners and students. Also to archive great music of the great maestros for the students to learn. That's why Obras de Música I mentioned before was largely pedagogical. And Hernando, Antonio de Cabezon's son, says in the preface that, it's impossible to capture all the grandeur of Cabezon's improvisation and playing abilities, but at least he said he put together these wonderful compositions meant for pedagogy, which are not really true reflections of everything that Antonio could do. So tablature was actually pedagogical, and even Correa de Araujo from Sevilla, in his Facultad Organica, says that it was a humane and merciful method, and that he also says it made something that was impossible before possible and more accessible to the student and the amateur. So it was an amateur, beginner-friendly notation. Now, if we in the 21st century just looked at something like what I showed you at the beginning of this video, we would freak out and think that it's some kind of an alien script. We would think that it's difficult and so foreign looking. But actually, to the 16th century mind, tablature was the easier version. It was the beginner-friendly version. With that in mind, I really wanted to approach tablature in the most historical sense possible. I developed an experimental module that was exactly what Correa de Araujo said, something that was pedagogical. So I created two modules, each module being about 50 minutes, so each session will take 1 hour, and I made two sessions, one training in Spanish tablature according to Obras de Música, and then second, a German module training in the tablature system of Bernhard Schmidt Tablaturbuch from 1607 that I showed you earlier. So this is what I did. First, the layout of notes on a keyboard. This is Spanish tablature. And then I would show something like a 5-note scale with the help of the keyboard, and then without the help of the keyboard. And then some melodic fragments. We also train in intervals for 5 to 10 minutes, and then eventually a 4-part harmony. So I would actually have my participants play actual excerpts from the tablature, some 2-voice Ave Maristella in a duo, and if the participant is also quite advanced in keyboard playing, we would be able to conclude the session with this 4-part Farbadones by Antonio de Cabezon. Now, the German module is very similar. I start with the layout of notes, and then we train in 5-note scales and some scalar fragments, and also intervals and harmonies, 4-part harmonies. And then we start playing one voice from a 4-part texture, and then we practice 2 voices, and then all 4 voices. And then at the end of the module, most of my intermediate advanced keyboard skill participants were able to pull off this piece by Andrea Gabrielli, found in the Bernhard Schmidt Tablaturbuch. These 2 modules were administered from June 2019 to January 2020 over this 8-month period time. I would spend 2 hours in person with each participant, of course, which was very time consuming for me, but very worthwhile. The ages of participants ranging from as young as 12 to as old as 70, in various levels of musical experience and keyboard proficiency. These 32 diverse group of men and women are from these countries. Now you see on the screen, and represented by these flags. And I recorded, of course, with the consent of the participants, I recorded either video or audio of all the sessions. Some are missing because I had one data loss, and a few participants did not prefer to have a recording. So other than that, mostly it was everything recorded, and I have more than 60 hours of audio and video footage of this entire experimental process. I developed a survey form for everyone to fill out, and I asked them 4 questions after each session. And the survey form included some of the, basic personal information, keyboard skills, how many years of training on the keyboard, whether they had previous experiences with reading music, or if they knew about tablature, including modern guitar tab, or if they were involved in early music at all. So the answers, the response to this experiment was actually very surprisingly positive. I thought it would be more kind of staggered out, like some people might be negative, some people might be positive, but it was astoundingly positive, and I was very surprised that everybody participated with so much enthusiasm and interest. And these were not only like my colleagues, but some old classmates, and even I had one, like a few strangers that, people that did not even know me. I had like one family member, and I had people from the professional music world, people from the community here in The Hague. This was the astoundingly positive response to the four questions I asked after the session. How was your experience of reading the tablature notation today? And it was so positive. Secondly, do you think it is possible to read music from this notation? And again, it was very positive, the response. With more experience and training, do you think you could become more fluent in this notation? And even the non-musicians and beginner and amateur musicians were quite positive. Do you think it is possible to perform from this notation? And again, so many people showed such positive optimism about this notation, which completely debunked the reactions and doubts that I had, that I received in the beginning stages of this research. Now I have a more comprehensive analysis and data on my full-length thesis, as well as some video clips and other things that I'm not able to share with you in this very short video. So in closing, tablature notation covers more than 2 centuries of early keyboard repertoire and stands as a true reflection of the nature and the structure of music from this period. Thinking from an earlier period forward into the 16th century, it is crucial to understand that this notation was a novelty and an ingenious conception at the time of its invention, which means studying and understanding this notation will widen one's perspective in the historically informed performance practice training. So this was a very personally uplifting artistic experience for me. I embraced performance from original notation like never before. Last year, my first year master recital was entirely performed from original notation, 3 pieces of which was in tablature, and it was a very rewarding but challenging and at first intimidating experience. And also wanted to say that tablature is significant in that it played a role for the beginning stages of the historical keyboard. If you think about it, coming from vocal polyphony from the Renaissance, polyphony can be performed only with a group of people. You need at least 2 people to perform polyphony. So polyphony by nature was always ensemble music making. But with the advent of the historical keyboard, polyphony became soloistic for the first time, because now it's one person playing all the lines, realizing on what the historical treatises say, the perfect instrument, a polyphonic instrument. So it is a great moment for my instrument and the family of my instruments, and it was so rewarding to find out more about this, all the history and the context of this notation. And I would like to perhaps inspire my colleagues to just check out this notation if they could, and hopefully also bring this back as a performance topic within the current HIP dialogue. So I hope that you enjoyed this video and all the information that I shared with you. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.